So welcome to the short demonstration of FAIR Solution 3, and we'll focus here on the case study 3, which is the risk map in Hamburg. And what we will talk a bit more about in the next few minutes is the knowledge production from scientific publications. So how is the situation currently? Currently we have papers usually, so researchers kind of summarize their most important findings and write it into a paper, which is then published, for example, in a scientific journal. So we have a very human-readable format, but not really a machine-readable format. On top of that, another problem is that often there's not enough information on how the results are really produced. So not always all the datasets are provided, and also not always the entire code or the output data and so on. And even if they are provided, it's not always clear what part of the code or what data was used to produce which individual results. So to sum it up, currently we have often scientific publications that are not really reproducible and also not interoperable because, like I already said, the formats are usually only human readable but not machine readable. Also, they are usually or sometimes not open and not always findable. Yeah, so currently scientific publications do not really align with the FAIR principles, and there's some ideas on how to improve the situation and make scientific publications more fair. And two options here are, on the one hand, the TIB Knowledge Loom, and then on the other hand, the Knowledge Dashboard. And I will present both of them to you in the next few minutes. Yes, and we will start with the TIB Knowledge Loom, which is an open science digital library of analysis-ready scientific knowledge. And the aim of the Knowledge Loom is to produce content that is reusable, reproducible, and open. And what is done is that the most important statements from a scientific publication, like a paper, are extracted from this publication, and then for each of these statements, the data, the analysis, and the code are provided, which makes it super reproducible because you can immediately see what results are produced from which data in which part of the code. And on top of that, to make it more interoperable, the knowledge is presented in a machine reusable form, either in Python or in R. And on the right side, you can see a little snippet of the website of the Knowledge Loom. This one is now for case study 3. So we have our paper, and the most important statements from this paper are here extracted on the right side. On top, there are some more information about the statements and about the research. And then, on the lower part, you can see the 3 different statements. So how is the Knowledge Loom now embedded in the whole FAIR2Adapt infrastructure? From FAIR Solution 2, we get our FAIR digital objects kind of as an output of the verification pipeline. And these FAIR digital objects are then stored in a repository, for example, in Zenodo. And these repositories then link to RoHub, which is kind of, in our case, like a central storage for all the different FAIR digital objects. And what is very nice is that the TIB Knowledge Loom is machine interoperable. That means it can then also access the FAIR digital objects in RoHub and also link to those FAIR digital objects. You can see in the lower part, for example, of the graph on the right side, that we have our different statements, and then for each statement we have our different input data, output data in software, as I explained before. And those statements and the data are then also in a machine-readable format and can therefore communicate with the RoHub. So what we can say is that the Loom sits at the end of the verification pipeline, and one of its benefits is that it can communicate our scientific findings to other researchers or other people who might be interested in them. So the Loom records can then be exported as JSON LD, and those are compatible with RoHub standards, and therefore, the scientific statements can then also be kept in RoHub and enrich the FAIR digital objects there. Now I will tell you a bit more about the scientific statements that were extracted for Hamburg. It is important to mention here that the scientific statements are not extracted by a machine, but actually are curated by the authors of the paper. So there are still scientists behind, the statements and the selection of the statements. For Hamburg, we extracted 3 different scientific statements, and I will go through each of them really quick right now. So the first statement is that pluvial flood risk in Hamburg is heterogeneous, with hotspots in districts like Eppendorf, where high mobility-related risk overlaps with high well-being-related risk. And what you can see here on the map is a little zoom in on the flood risk map, and you can see the district of Eppendorf. And what is kind of stated in this statement is that we have, on the one hand, pluvial flood risk to mobility and accessibility, which are the yellow spots, and then we also have a pluvial flood risk to well-being, which are the purple spots. Then the second part, or the second statement, is that the combined presentation of social vulnerability and pluvial flood risk highlights areas where socially vulnerable populations are disproportionately affected by pluvial flooding. And what you can see here is basically the same map. So we still have the pluvial flood risk hotspots, but on top of that, we underlay those hotspots with the social vulnerability index, which we calculated. And you can see the darker the gray shade is, the higher the vulnerability. And what the statement says is that we actually have some areas in which we have very high social vulnerability and also high flood risk. So this coincides and makes it maybe more pressing to do some adaptation measures to help vulnerable populations. Now coming to the third statement, it says that the decomposition of social vulnerability reveals district-specific risk drivers, showing that Billstedt's risk is defined by low coping capacity, while Eppendorf's vulnerability is driven by age-related sensitivity. And to understand the statement, we shortly have to discuss what was done here. So we differentiated within the social vulnerability component between coping capacity and sensitivity. Coping capacity talks more about how well people are able to prepare for certain flooding events and then also respond to flooding events during the event, but also in the aftermath. Whereas sensitivity is more about the effect that flooding has on the people in the situation of the flooding. So how prone to damage are people during the flooding events. And we chose different population groups as proxy for coping capacity and sensitivity. For the coping capacity, we on the one hand have social welfare recipients because they don't really have that much financial means, and therefore, we said that they are more vulnerable to flooding. And also people without a high school diploma, because here there's a higher chance that those people might not be able to inform themselves in a way that they are prepared for a flooding event. And also education can be seen as a proxy again for poverty, or there's at least a correlation between education and income. And therefore, those two indicators were used to kind of portray the coping capacity within a district. And then on the other hand, we have people with high sensitivity, which are people that are, like I said, in the moment of a flooding more at risk. So on the one hand, we have children under 10 years because they might not be able to make decisions on their own, yet they still depend on like adult people to be helped and are also weaker physically. And then on the other hand, we have elderly singles over 65 years. Here we also have the physical component. So elderly people are often also not that fit anymore or might have some injuries or some disabilities. And on the other hand, they might also not be that connected to other people and therefore also more at risk. What we can see here and what the statement in the end states is that we have in some areas of the city a high vulnerability because of the low coping capacity, which is the case in Billstedt. So in the right lower corner, you can see that most of the area is green, which indicates a low coping capacity. And then in some other areas, for example, in Eppendorf, we have a very blue shading, which is then like a indicator that we have a lot of age-related sensitivity. Now, you can see here on the left side is the paper, and then we extracted the scientific statements, as I already explained before, and this is then portrayed on the website. So this is just a very short summary of what was done, the whole process for the Knowledge Loom. And when we then click on one of these statements on the Knowledge Loom website, we can get the different information. So on the left side, you can see what kind of unfolds when we click on one of these statements. And on the right side, you have like a little bit more information on what you can see there on the left side. So first we have some more information about the used software and the methods. We can, for example, see exactly the code snippets that were used to produce this specific statement. Then we also have the input data that was used, the output data that was produced, and then also the source code. So there we can see the entire Python code, for example, or the entire R code or whatever software was used to produce the scientific statements or the scientific results in the paper. A second option beside the Loom to communicate research to other researchers or stakeholders is the knowledge dashboard. And here knowledge is presented in the form of an interactive map, where we then can have different layers, which are very easy to understand and also easy to grasp for people who are not really from the field or are not really into data science. And on top of that, it's machine operable, and therefore it can connect to RoHub. I will now show you a short demo of how such a knowledge dashboard could look like. What you can see here now is the dashboard, or an example of how the dashboard could look like, because right now this is just like a test dashboard, and also the data that you can see here is just test data. And in this case, we have it here now for Bremen, but the same structure could be applied to Hamburg. And the first map I will show you now, or which has been implemented, is the usual pluvial flood risk map. And as you can see here, we have the different districts, which are identified by those lines here. These are also not the real districts in Bremen, but just some test data. And then we can see here hotspots of pluvial flood risk and the differentiation between mobility and accessibility and well-being. So the purple dots indicate a pluvial flood risk to well-being, and the yellow dots are pluvial flood risk to mobility and accessibility. And now, if we want to switch between different maps, we can just click here on the left side and change the visualization. And now we can see a second map, which kind of corresponds to the map from the second statement that was extracted. So where we talk about the social vulnerability as well. And what you can see here is now that an additional layer was added where the social vulnerability is indicated, and where different steps from low to very high social vulnerability are visible now. The same is possible with the data on sensitivity and coping capacity, so those can then also be visualized. And here on the right side, you always have the legend, and then on the left side, you can choose between the different options. So I think this is a very easy and very straightforward tool that will be particularly beneficial for stakeholders and city planners to just understand the research that was done, and maybe then also be able to really take the research and use it for planning in the city and to adapt the city to climate change. Now a very short summary of FAIR Solution 2 and FAIR Solution 3. So as an input for FAIR Solution 2, we had the raw input data as well as the software, and then also the output data. And the process that was then done to this data in code was the verification pipeline. So what happened was that DOIs were assigned, metadata was extracted, then certain metadata files were created, like the code meta.json file, the license file, and the citation CFF file.
And then on top of that, we also have more metadata, for example, on the authors or access conditions. The storage is in repositories. On the one hand, we here have Zenodo, which is public and has open access, but you can also restrict access, so both options are possible. And there's another option, which is DSI publish, where, for example, private data or restricted data can be stored very nicely. Then for FAIR Solution 3, we take the FAIR digital objects that were produced in the verification pipeline of FAIR Solution 2 and also the publication in text format, so the paper. And then for the Knowledge Loom, the most important scientific statements are extracted from the paper. And then more information is given on the specific scientific methods that were used, on the scientific software that was used, and also the input and the output data. And all of this is then provided on the website of the Knowledge Loom. Like I said, the research objects and FAIR digital objects, they are all stored in RoHub and linked to the different other infrastructures. And then for the knowledge dashboard, we have this very interactive map. Currently, this map is planned for Hamburg and Bremen, but if more research or more research is done in different other cities, of course, this could be added. And this is mostly for decision makers and city planners, so they get very easy access to the data and to the scientific findings. And we then have this very evidence-linked risk hotspots, which are very clear and very visually, presentable.